Hello, and thanks for joining me. I'm out for a ride today on my Harley-Davidson, my Dyna Fat Bob. It's a pretty cold day, actually. And so it's time for some more songs from the saddle, musings on motorcycling and motorcycling life. And today I'm looking at the changing face of motorcycling, the motorcycling world, and asking the question, are millennials killing motorcycling? Now, more specifically, are millennials killing Harley-Davidson? Because I actually don't think millennials are killing motorcycling at all. They're just changing it, and I think in many ways changing it for the better, as you'll see as I set out my arguments. But for Harley-Davidson, it's really not good news. I think everybody knows that Harley-Davidson is struggling at the moment, and that younger people are just not buying Harley-Davidsons, and the customer base of Harley-Davidson are getting older and obviously slowly dying out or stopping riding. And this is something Harley-Davidson are painfully aware of and are fighting against. So let's have a look at this then, a little bit more detail. Let's start by getting a bit of generational terminology sorted out. I'm a boomer, which is baby boomer, which is the generation, the group that was born between 1955 and 1964. And we were followed by Generation X, who were born between 1965 and 1980. So most Harley riders fall in these two generational groups. As I say, that's a fact that Harley-Davidson are painfully aware of. Millennials are the group that were born between 1981 and 1996. So it's the group who are currently aged between 25 and 40 years old. And this is a very significant group for the motorcycling industry. I've been looking at a lot of research into this and into who buys bikes and what types of bikes they buy, and it's very interesting. Research has shown that millennials are less likely to ride a motorcycle than the older generations, and furthermore, those who do ride buy motorcycles for very different reasons, and therefore they have very different selection criteria for the bikes that they buy. So I've spent quite a lot of time looking at the research into this, and it is very interesting. So let's unpick some of the issues here. Now, one thing that I'm very much aware of is that younger people they quite literally live in a different world to my generation, to me. They grew up in a very different environment, and therefore they have very different values and a different outlook on life. Now, these are, of course, broad generalizations, and there will be several exceptions to the comments that I make, but generally, millennials are more risk-averse than my generation, and therefore many of them see motorcycles as just being too risky. Those who are risk seekers find their thrills in other activities, mainly in these carefully packaged sports that are marketed as adventurous and desirable. And this points to another issue, and that is that motorcycle marketing is just not speaking to this generation, to the millennial generation. And manufacturers really need to change their marketing strategies. But I have to say, I think we are seeing some evidence of a change here. Millennials also have a very different relationship with money, particularly with credit, and then with debt, of course. So credit is easy these days, and many younger people are actually heavily in debt with student loans, huge mortgages, and things like all their household appliances and furniture and things that they're buying on credit, and therefore they simply do not have the financial means to afford a motorcycle as just as a toy, as a leisure thing. They can only really justify buying a motorcycle if it's their main means of transport, and that's something I'll come to in a minute. Also, I think for younger people, there are far more transport options available to them than there were when I was younger. So, buying and insuring and running a motorcycle is just not the most convenient option for most millennials, whereas it probably was for my generation. We chose motorcycles as a cheap means of transport. Many people in my age group, in the baby boomer age group, got into motorcycles because they couldn't afford cars. It was the cheap form of transport. But of course, younger people do buy and ride motorcycles. But interestingly, research shows that when they do, it's for entirely different reasons to why baby boomers like myself or Generation Xers buy bikes. And so this has huge implications for companies like Harley-Davidson. So why do younger people ride? Well, again, looking at the research, it suggested that millennials and younger have two main motives for buying motorcycles, and they are very different to those of the typical Harley-Davidson owner. So your average Harley-Davidson customer is a married man in his 50s with a household income of above $90,000 per year. So these are rubs, aren't they? These are the rich urban bikers. Bikes are a hobby to them. So most Harley-Davidson riders spend a fortune on their bike and accessories for it and all the branded clothing that completes the image, but they don't actually ride very much. They just ride on sunny summer Sundays. Nice bit of alliteration there. Obviously, painting with a very broad brush here, and I'm not saying this is all Harley-Davidsons, but what we're talking about here is statistics. So we're talking about the average Harley-Davidson customer. Whenever you talk about averages, there's always going to be people on the extreme. So if you're sort of blue-collar, low-income rider Harley-Davidson, good luck to you. You're a perfectly valid Harley rider, but this is what the research has shown your typical Harley rider is. It's a middle-aged, fairly wealthy, comfortable, well-off man who has his Harley-Davidson as a toy to play out with occasionally on a Sunday, and he's really just into all the image and style that comes with it. Okay, so why do millennials buy bikes then? Well, it seems that millennials are buying bikes for very different reasons to baby boomers. Many younger riders see a bike as cheaper and more convenient transport than a car, particularly if they live in an urban environment, if they live in a big city. It's just easier to get about, easier to park, easier to store, etc. And they want something that is small, light, economical, and practical for city riding. Now, unfortunately, Harley-Davidsons fit none of these criteria. And, as I talk about this, you can see some of the developments that Harley-Davidson are trying to bring in their range of bikes to address these issues. So younger riders obviously also want a bike that's cool, and I strongly suspect that there is a bit of intergenerational kickback going on here as well. So if you're young, you want to establish your own identity and your own image, your own cool, and so riding the same bike as your dad or even your granddad is definitely not cool. So of course there are some millennials who do want a motorcycle pure as a hobby, and they tend to, as I said, they've probably got less disposable income available, and so therefore there's been a huge trend in cafe racers and other style of bikes built on a much cheaper platform. Small capacity second-hand bikes, for example. So old Japanese bikes of the 80s and 90s have become popular as donor bikes for cheap garage-built customs for millennials. So, they're looking at very different kind of criteria. The big heavyweight cruisers that Harley-Davidson build just are not appealing to millennials. So although this might sound like bad news for Harley-Davidson, I actually think that it's good news for the motorcycle industry more generally. In a way, that the wheels of society are turning, and it's kind of taken us back to the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s, when motorcycles were definitely a means of transport rather than a hobby, and they were a cheap means of transport that provided young people with freedom, their own sense of identity, and their own coolness. And I think we're seeing this amongst younger people at the moment, and that's very positive, very positive. So, those manufacturers who are offering cheaper but chic small capacity machines that are very affordable, for example, the main example that stands out is Royal Enfield. Manufacturers like that are just doing so well at the moment. And also, millennials and the generation that comes after them, called Generation Z or Generation Z, that includes the 17 to 24-year-olds, they're of course more interested in electric bikes as well. So, the motorcycle industry is changing to meet the needs and the interests and the tastes of these younger generation. It has to, otherwise it's going to die. And that's positive. Things change, things move along. Harley-Davidson needs to change and needs to move along. Us baby boomers, we don't like it. We don't like it when Harley-Davidson produces electric bikes and small, mid-capacity, lightweight, city bikes. We don't like it, but we are not the up-and-coming generation that is the future for these industries. And, that's it. Things change, things move on. So, are millennials killing motorcycling? No, definitely not. They're just changing motorcycling. Are they killing Harley-Davidson? Well, possibly, if Harley-Davidson is not able to change and respond and meet the needs and desires and tastes of these younger riders. But I think it is. I think Harley-Davidson is changing, and we're going to see huge changes in the offerings from Harley-Davidson over the next 10, 15 years. So, that's it from me today, folks. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing to my channel for more content like this. Thank you very much for joining me. Please ride safely, and I'll see you again next time.